Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to dive into something pretty unique in global politics. We're talking about the people of Taiwan and their national identity, which kind of exists in this international gray zone.
Yeah.
We've got some really fascinating source material to dig into.
Oh, yeah.
We're looking at opinions from the United States Court of Appeals and the District Court for D.C., and it all centers around this legal case where some residents of Taiwan were trying to get recognized as U.S. nationals.
Right.
And most importantly, they wanted U.S. passports.
That's right. When you sent me these legal documents, it really struck me how this specific legal challenge, it almost acts like a magnifying glass,
Yeah.
Like it reveals all these historical and legal complexities that have led to this really ambiguous status that Taiwan has on the world stage. So I think for this deep dive, our mission is to try to understand these complexities, especially through this case and the U.S. government's position. And, the question that just keeps popping up over and over is this: who really has sovereignty over Taiwan?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's got a surprisingly tangled history.
Yeah.
So let's unpack this a bit. I mean, where does this whole complicated situation even begin?
Well, you have to go all the way back to 1895 at the end of the Sino-Japanese War. And, China was defeated and they had to sign this treaty called the Treaty of Shimonoseki. And this treaty basically made them give up Taiwan, which back then was known as Formosa, to Japan.
Okay.
And so for about 50 years, Taiwan was under Japanese rule.
Okay, so Japan's in control. Then I guess the next big turning point would have to be the end of World War II in 1945.
Right.
Japan's defeated, surrenders. And this is where things get really interesting, I think.
Yeah.
General Douglas MacArthur, he was acting as the supreme commander for the Allied powers.
Right.
And he issues this directive that tells Japanese commanders in both China and in Taiwan to surrender to Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, who was the leader of the Chinese Nationalist Party at the time.
Yes, and that surrender was definitely very significant, marking the end of Japanese control. But it's important to remember that it was really mostly meant for the purpose of military deoccupation and getting all the Japanese personnel back home. It didn't really specifically say anything about transferring the legal sovereignty of Taiwan. So think of it more like just a kind of temporary administrative handover. And then, of course, you have the Chinese Civil War, which ended in 1949 when the People's Republic of China, the PRC, was established on the mainland.
Right.
So Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalist government, they are the Republic of China, the ROC. They had to relocate to Taiwan.
So now you've basically got these two separate groups, both saying they're the real China, with the PRC running the mainland, and the ROC governing Taiwan. This is what sets the stage for another really important event, the 1951 San Francisco Peace Treaty, the SFPT. And in this treaty, Japan officially says they don't have any claim to Taiwan or the Pescadores Islands. So that should have cleared things up, right?
Well, not exactly. The interesting thing about the SFPT is what it doesn't say. So Japan gives up its claim, right? But the treaty never actually says who they're giving sovereignty to.
Oh, wow.
That question is just left completely unanswered. The treaty does say that the United States is the principal occupying power, but it doesn't define what that occupation really means or how far it goes. And get this, neither the ROC, who are now in Taiwan, nor the PRC on the mainland, they didn't sign or ratify or even formally agree to this treaty. And as was pointed out in the legal opinions that we're looking at, there were earlier drafts of the SFPT that actually did specifically say Taiwan should go to China, but that language was changed in the final version.
Interesting.
They intentionally left it out. It wasn't a mistake. It was a calculated move that set the stage for Taiwan's ambiguous status that we see even today.
We're so intentional ambiguity right from the get-go.
Okay.
So the question of who's really in charge of Taiwan is still unanswered. What happens in the years after that?
Well, in 1954, remember, the Cold War was heating up and the U.S. wanted to, create some stability in that region. So they decided to sign the Mutual Defense Treaty with the ROC. So at this point, with the Cold War intensifying, the U.S. was really on the side of the government in Taiwan.
Right.
They were seeing them as the legitimate leaders of China, at least when it came to defense. And in this treaty, the U.S. recognized that the ROC had control over Taiwan and promised to help them if there was ever a big conflict with the PRC. So basically, at this time, the U.S. is backing the ROC as the real government of all of China, including Taiwan.
Got it. But that doesn't last, does it? Because in the 1970s, things start to change, right? U.S. policy shifts pretty dramatically.
Yeah, that's right. Starting around 1972, the U.S. started to acknowledge that the PRC saw Taiwan as part of China, and more importantly, they decided they weren't going to challenge that view.
Okay.
This led to a huge diplomatic shift in 1979. The U.S. officially recognized the PRC as the only legitimate government of China, and they stopped recognizing the ROC.
Wow, that's a pretty big change in who they're aligning with.
Yeah.
So the U.S. goes from saying the ROC is the government of China to recognizing the PRC. What happens to their relationship with Taiwan? Does it just end?
Well, no. Congress stepped in and tried to define this new relationship with the Taiwan Relations Act, the TRA, in 1979. And this act created what they called an unofficial relationship between the U.S. and the people on Taiwan. It allowed them to continue things like trade, cultural exchanges, things like that. The TRA also created the American Institute in Taiwan, the AIT, which basically acts as the U.S. embassy there. However, and this is important, especially as it relates to our legal documents, the TRA did not give the AIT the power to process passport applications for people living in Taiwan.
Okay, so the U.S. keeps these unofficial ties and even agrees to help Taiwan defend itself, but they still don't recognize Taiwan as its own country. This really is starting to sound like the policy of strategic ambiguity that we hear so much about.
Exactly. And over the years, the U.S. has really developed this strategic ambiguity approach to the question of Taiwan sovereignty. It's like this balancing act they're trying to do to keep things peaceful and stable in the region without actually saying whether or not they'd get involved militarily if the PRC ever decided to attack Taiwan.
Right.
And then to make things even more complicated, in 1982, the U.S. gave Taiwan what they called the 6 assurances. And one of those assurances was a promise not to officially recognize Chinese sovereignty over Taiwan.
Okay.
And then in 2004, Secretary of State Colin Powell very clearly stated that the U.S. doesn't see Taiwan as an independent or sovereign nation.
It sounds like they're really walking a tightrope here.
Yeah.
And to add even more to the mix, our sources mention another treaty, the Treaty of Peace between the ROC and Japan, signed in 1952. This is sometimes called the Treaty of Taipei. Did that treaty clarify anything about the sovereignty question?
Not really when it comes to who they were transferring sovereignty to. Much like the SFTT, it acknowledged that Japan was giving up its claims to Taiwan, but it didn't say that sovereignty was being transferred to China. And, the district court opinion points out something really interesting. After that SFPT was signed, a bunch of important allied governments like the U.S., the U.K., and France, they all publicly said that the treaty didn't actually transfer sovereignty of Taiwan to China.
Wow.
They were basically saying that legally it was still kind of up in the air.
So for decades, the big players on the world stage have been intentionally keeping Taiwan's status unclear. So that brings us to this legal challenge that those Taiwanese residents started. What were they hoping to achieve?
Well, back in 2006, a group of people living in Taiwan, who were also members of the Taiwan Nation Party, they tried a few times to apply for U.S. passports through the AIT. Their main argument was that since the SFPT named the U.S. as the principal occupying power and didn't say who the new sovereign was, that meant the U.S. actually had temporary legal sovereignty over Taiwan until a permanent decision was made.
Yeah.
And because of that, they claimed, they were non-citizen U.S. nationals who owed permanent allegiance to the United States, and therefore they should be able to get U.S. passports.
So they're basically saying, hey, because of how the SFPT is written and the fact that the U.S. was the main occupying power, we're actually U.S. nationals.
Right.
And what were they specifically asking the courts to do?
They wanted the court to issue declarations saying that the AIT was wrong to refuse to process their passport applications, and that they were, in fact, U.S. nationals with all the rights that go with that, according to the U.S. Constitution. They specifically mentioned their First Amendment right to petition the government, their Fifth Amendment right to due process, Eighth Amendment protection against cruel and unusual punishment, arguing that not having a recognized nationality was cruel and unusual punishment, and 14th Amendment rights to due process and equal protection. So, the courts might see this as just a political question, but for the people of Taiwan, this abstract legal concept has real consequences for their lives and how they're seen in the world.
It's a pretty creative legal strategy. So how did the American courts respond to all of this?
Well, both the district court and the Court of Appeals ended up dismissing the case. They said it was a political question and not something they could rule on.
Okay, so they invoked the political question doctrine. Can you explain a bit more about what that means in this context?
Sure. Basically, the political question doctrine says that there are some types of issues that the Constitution specifically gives to the executive and legislative branches of government, meaning the president and Congress.
Right.
And because of that, the courts are supposed to stay out of it.
Okay.
And the courts in this case decided that figuring out who has sovereignty over a territory is definitely one of those political questions that's not for them to decide.
I see.
As the Court of Appeals opinion actually says, who is the sovereign de jure or de facto of a territory is not a judicial but a political question. And they referenced some big legal precedents to back this up, cases like Baker v. Carr and Jones v. United States.
So the courts are basically saying this isn't our problem. It's up to the president and Congress to figure out who has authority over Taiwan, not us.
Yeah, exactly. And the appellants in this case argued that interpreting treaties and laws is a core job of the courts. It's part of Article 3 of the Constitution. And the courts actually agreed that they technically could analyze the treaties involved, like the SFPT, but they ultimately decided not to do that because they said this issue of sovereignty is just way too tied up with U.S. foreign policy, which is something the Constitution says is the responsibility of the political branches. The Court of Appeals did clarify that if the executive branch ever does officially say who Taiwan's sovereign is, then the courts could maybe step in and decide what that means for the status and rights of the people there. But the important point is that the executive branch has been intentionally avoiding making that kind of decision for over 60 years.
And that silence really says a lot, doesn't it?
It really does.
Now, the appellants specifically pointed to that phrase in the SFPT, the Principal Occupying Power Clause, saying that it basically meant the U.S. had temporary sovereignty. How did the courts respond to that?
They acknowledged that the appellants weren't directly asking them to say who Taiwan's permanent sovereign is. They were just asking the court to interpret the SFPT as saying the U.S. had this kind of temporary sovereignty. But the court said even interpreting that principal occupying power clause in terms of sovereignty is itself a political question. They said they have to defer to the president and Congress on issues like international relations and sovereignty. So even the very thing the appellants were basing their argument on, the SFPT, was considered too politically sensitive for the courts to interpret in a way that would define sovereignty, even temporarily.
The appellants also brought up that Supreme Court case, Boumediene v. Bush. Why did they bring that up, and how did the courts distinguish it from the Taiwan situation?
Well, the appellants argued that if the Supreme Court could rule on things like detaining enemy combatants at Guantanamo Bay, which also had big implications for foreign policy, then they should definitely be able to rule on how to interpret the SFPT. But the Court of Appeals said that Boumediene was different. They pointed out that Boumediene was about the U.S. actually exercising control, what they called de facto sovereignty, in a specific place, Guantanamo Bay. And it didn't overturn this political question doctrine when it comes to legal sovereignty or de jure sovereignty, which is what the Taiwan case is all about. The court really emphasized that the U.S. doesn't actually control the people on Taiwan. So Boumediene was about how far U.S. power reaches in a place it already controls, while this case is about whether the U.S. even has that fundamental legal claim to Taiwan in the first place.
Yeah. So it's two different sides of international law and U.S. power. Boumediene was about the limits of U.S. power in a place they controlled, and this case is about whether they even have the right to be involved in Taiwan at all. What about when they compare it to the Philippines?
Yeah, they tried to draw a parallel there, too. They pointed to the U.S.'s relationship with the Philippines after Spain gave it to them in 1898. They argued that the people in Taiwan, just like the Filipinos, owed permanent allegiance to the U.S. and should therefore be considered U.S. nationals. But the court rejected that comparison.
Wow.
They said that in the case of the Philippines, it was Congress, not the courts, that said the Filipino people were entitled to U.S. protection. And they did that because the U.S. had officially declared sovereignty over the Philippines. Then later, Congress acknowledged that the U.S. was withdrawing its sovereignty and changed the status of Filipinos accordingly. So with the Philippines, the political branches had very clearly made decisions about the relationship and the status of the people, which hasn't happened with Taiwan.
And lastly, the appellants brought up this idea of permanent allegiance under U.S. law.
Oh.
What did the court have to say about that?
They cited a part of U.S. law that defines a national of the United States as someone who, even though they're not a citizen, still owes permanent allegiance to the U.S. The appellants said they fit that definition, but the court agreed with most other courts that have looked at this issue and said that just feeling like you owe permanent allegiance doesn't automatically make you a U.S. national. They pointed to the very specific definition of non-citizen national in U.S. law, which includes people born in places like American Samoa and Swains Island, but specifically says it doesn't include Taiwan. So even if the appellants feel a strong sense of allegiance to the U.S., legally speaking, that doesn't give them U.S. nationality in this situation.
So basically, the courts kind of sidestepped the whole thing by saying it's a political hot potato that they don't want to touch.
Pretty much, yeah. The biggest takeaway from this legal challenge is that it really shows how Taiwan's status has been intentionally left unclear for all these years. And that's because of all these complex geopolitical factors and the U.S.'s strategic ambiguity policy. The courts made it super clear that they weren't going to wade into these politically sensitive waters and try to decide who has sovereignty or what that means for the Taiwanese people. They said that's a decision for the U.S. government, meaning the president and Congress.
It really makes you think about what it must be like for the millions of people living in Taiwan. They're living in this international gray area without a government that's universally recognized.
Yeah.
It's a truly unique situation globally, especially given the delicate relationship between the U.S. and China. Like the Court of Appeals said, they're in political purgatory. It makes you wonder what it's actually like to live in a place where your own nationality is basically a question mark on the world stage. And obviously this is an ongoing situation that's still developing, so it's something we need to keep paying attention to.
Absolutely. It raises some really deep questions about what national identity and belonging even mean when the political realities are so uncertain and intentionally undefined. What's it really like to live without a clear place on the world's political map? That's something to really think about.
Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.